Since the 1990s, national identity has shifted towards Taiwaneseness. Taiwan has grown wealthy, but suffers some environmental and social hangovers. It grapples with minority issues, while the China-Taiwan divide drives politics. The two sides have drifted apart, and Taiwan resists China's demands for unification. Where will it end? Admiral Li Shimin, head of the Taiwan military until 2019, and now also an author, is unhappy with what he calls the dangerous common view in Taiwan.
台湾人现在的问题是说，他也不想打仗，但是他也不想投降。其实这是一种很糟糕的态度，因为如果你不想打仗，你要拿出方法来。
According to polling, most respondents say they are very or somewhat willing to defend Taiwan if China attacks, but that leaves a significant portion who apparently lean toward capitulation or rapprochement, reflecting broader political divisions. He believes Taiwan needs to be ready to fight.
不打仗当然是最好的选择啦，但是问题是，你愿不愿意接受不打仗的条件？对不对？这个我也相信，这个中国大陆它这个一国两制、和平统一，我相信啊，但是并不代表你一定要接受他们的政治制度。但如果你还是要坚持这个生命的价值、生活的意义，你如果还有一些这些坚持，你认为这个 human right， 对不对？这 democracy， 对不对 ？justice。这些都很重要。那你要捍卫自己的话，你要为你的生活方式捍卫的话，你就没有办法同意他的和平方案。
How ready is Taiwan? Its military is just a tenth the size of China's. Size doesn't always matter in things military, but Taiwan's approach has been criticized for such things as reliability and poor training of new recruits. Many point to lessons it needs to learn from Ukraine.
过去啊，在20-30年前呢，我们用传统的方法来准备我们自己，因为那个时候中国还没那么强，那是没有问题的。但现在中国越来越强大，你要防卫自己，就要用一个不对称的思维，因为你用对称的思维，它的资源。不管是人力、物力、财力，都远远超过于你。你用相同跟他一样的方法来对抗他，你注定要失败。
Traditional defense relies on big ships and advanced planes, all very expensive and easily blown up by the enemy. Asymmetrical defense is about smaller, more maneuverable, more survivable weapons, like shoulder-launched anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons, or unmanned boats and drones like those used in Ukraine. Only in the last couple of years, he says, on the advice of the American military, has Taiwan begun to take this tack.
我从军事观点上来看啊，我们并没有准备好，然后我也不认为哪一天我们会自己认为准备好了，因为这是一个永无休止的准备的过程嘛。
Taiwan has its own defense industry and recently produced its own submarine and drones. Taiwan is trying to balance asymmetrical with a traditional defense. This policy contest reflects China's intensifying threat. President Xi Jinping insists China will use force, if needed, to bring about unification, which in his words is inevitable and cannot be passed on to future generations. A big part of China's timing will depend on what it thinks the U.S. is willing to do. Taiwan cannot stand alone. It can only fend off invasion until the United States comes to its aid. The U.S. has a policy towards Taiwan, often described as strategic ambiguity, whose aim is to avoid taking sides and encouraging conflict. However, this means Washington won't officially say whether it would help Taiwan. President Biden says it will, and most Taiwanese believe it will. Even so, Taiwan's defense is first up to Taiwan. At Fort Guangshan, the giant Buddhist shrine outside Kaohsiung, we followed the paths, copied sutras, and meditated, gathering from our visit that we should believe that we are the masters of our fates.
The first question, I mean, not the first, but maybe the second question that they asked was, did you see the war coming in February 2022?
I am talking to Philip Nobel, a Czech journalist based in Taiwan, who in 2023 traveled as an interlocutor to Ukraine with Taiwan's leading experts in civil defense and the analysis of disinformation. They wanted to understand what Taiwan could learn from Ukraine's experience.
Literally everyone we talked to said, we just could not believe it. So we were maybe intellectually prepared, but emotionally as beings, we were not prepared because we could just not imagine the reality and also the impact and the details of what does it mean when suddenly you're invaded by allegedly the biggest army, the most powerful army in the world, and the country collapses for a few days, right? And there's no preparation for this. And immediately then the question, I think, for a lot of Taiwanese people who think about those issues is, are we Taiwanese actually able to imagine, for example, a Chinese military invasion? And what should we do when it happens? So most of the conversations were precisely on what did you do then, once you kind of went through the shock of this information that you were able to even process, because it's huge. The message that a lot of Ukrainians told our Taiwanese friends was, don't think it can not happen. We don't know, you never know when, but you should not think that it will not happen. And if you want to avoid it, you should always think that it will happen. So it's kind of, preparing war to have peace.
Many people in Taiwan have not wanted to think about that, but increasingly they are. In a poll, 42% said they thought China would invade by 2027. That's up from 28% 2 years before. A few take shooting courses with plastic pellet guns. The mainstream learn about what to do in the event of invasion. In courses given by Kuma, thousands are learning to spot disinformation, to deal with emergencies when internet and electricity fail, to administer basic first aid, like tying a tourniquet, and how to survive in a conflict. These Kuma classes are booked up months ahead, and it plans to train 2 million people within a few years. More widely, Taiwan is preparing its defense. Apart from increasing its military budget yearly with a 14% jump to $19 billion in 2023 and extending military conscript training to a full year in 2024, the government has long been promoting its international profile and winning friends to make up for Taiwan's enforced diplomatic isolation. As of mid-2024, only a dozen tiny countries officially recognize Taiwan. The government also encourages business to reduce dependency on China trade. And in 2023, trade with Southeast Asia exceeded that with China, which remained the largest trading partner. Taiwan has robust disinformation debunking. Independent groups track, analyze, and report on the deluge of lies sent towards Taiwan. Journalists like Brian Hioe are training to be war correspondents.
So I think it's better to be overprepared or prepare and then nothing happens. But also, what's interesting is China's always watching. So China, if they do see people preparing for this kind of thing, I mean, if you do have this notion that the population will resist and is taking measures, then that actually is a deterrent as well.
China is waging a battle for hearts and minds.
他要告诉你的是，你反抗是没用的。他一直在告诉我啊，反抗没用啊，解放军有多强啊，然后这个攻台7天之内，台湾一定怎么样？他就是要告诉你反抗没有用，反抗没有用，反抗没有用。那我们这边呢，应该是要告诉大家说，其实我们有足够的能力保护自己。那后来这个乌俄战争，台湾人在看呢，台湾人在看什么？在看乌克兰可不可以抵挡俄罗斯的攻击。可是时间久了下来之后，大家发现说，其实抵抗不是没有用的，这也是会强化我们自己所说的，我们愿意去投资更多在国防上面，所以这些事情是我知道中国一定会不断的施加更多的压力，但重点是我们 政府的作为必须要让台湾的民众看到信心之所在，这才是重点。
Some Taiwanese performers show their defiance against Chinese threats. Duogi, a Taiwanese hip-hop artist, challenges oppression and celebrates his homeland in his lyrics.
他跟一群人走在崎岖路上，他即将去的山顶，没人到过那地方。他心想的憧憬是山顶风景，从今必得风景，但他自信莫名。
I met someone who had no doubt about the number one domestic issue in Taiwan.
就是那个 geopolitics 地缘政治。
国内是最重要的问题是 geopolitics。
对啊，因为他们都在影响我们啊。因为这个 geopolitics 就是中国跟美国的关系如果不好，那它对台湾有一种影响；他们的关系很好，对台湾也是有影响。因为就是台湾就会变成是一个在中间的，很像就是一个 balance act， 就是你如何在这个很大的这个 superpower 里面去找到一个平衡，让你还是可以 survive。我觉得这个是台湾很大的困境。
The U.S. is becoming under threat, so to speak, because you have the rising China and then you have the resurgent Russia, and the two seems to be in a quasi-alliance, challenging the U.S. Predominant position in international politics, the global economy, and particularly in terms of values and institutions. So I think that's where the conflict comes from.
This political, economic, and ideological competition, he notes, has been stoked by U.S. and Chinese stridency and by territorial disputes in the South and East China Seas. It is also strategic, as Taiwan is a fulcrum of U.S. dominance, supporting the defense of allies like Japan and South Korea. China hopes to displace U.S. power in the Pacific by taking control of Taiwan.
And it is within this context that you have the intensification of conflict between Taiwan and the PRC. And that has its roots, and everyone knows, back all the way to 1949 when China was divided and you have two governments, both claim the sovereignty of the other side. But that framework did not explain fully the ups and downs of cross-strait relations.
He says tensions rise or fall with the party in power. The KMT's opening to China from 2008 led to détente under former KMT President Ma. He and KMT hardliners want to revive that relationship, evidently pleasing Xi Jinping, even though the KMT's earlier cozying up to Beijing sparked the 2014 sunflower protests. That helped bring the China-wary DPP back into office in 2016, stoking a clash with Chinese nationalism.
So we have this change within Taiwan that coincides the change of the big picture, and both changes are in the direction of more confrontation and conflict with China.
In his view, if the situation is handled poorly, a conflict worse than the Ukraine war could erupt, engulfing the whole world. But what could upset the balance and trigger war?
如果中国要强大的话，他照理说不应该打，他维持他更强大的发展，他战争一定有代价嘛，对，像俄国现在也要支付他的代价，啊，但是呢，踩到底线的时候，他忍无可忍的时候，我不计任何代价我也要打，哪怕是 irrational 的 decision， 我也做了，啊，所以这个是两岸之间，就是说，如果美中的关系如果不好的话，那这个使得就是说大陆方面就是说变成可能有这种非理性的作为，他使用武力啊，使用武力，所以我很难预测，但是只能说，当大陆发觉统一这条这个 option 是绝望的话，他就可能使用武力了。绝望，他现在还没绝望嘛。
For the artist, all these matters also impinge on Taiwan's ability to manage its own affairs.
所以我们是有我们自己的独立的政府，可是 我们能不能称我们自己是一个国家？我们当然认为我们是一个国家，可是全世界没有人承认我们啊。即便我们自己想要说我们要成为一个独立的一个国家，你看马上美国不允许我们，中国当然也更不允许我们，周边都不允许，所以我们如何以国家的形式生存，这个都是非常现实的。
The ancient art of Tai Chi, performed under the banyan trees in the 228 Peace Park, is all about patience, a virtue much extolled in Chinese and Taiwanese traditions. I am in Taipei at the memorial to Sun Yat-sen, known as the father of modern China.
His dreams of democracy and nationalism still linger today on both sides of the Taiwan Strait.
Sun's ideas helped shape Taiwan's democracy, which ranks among the top 10 in the world today. Its success contradicts the Chinese Communist Party's insistence that liberal democracy is unsuitable for Chinese society. It shows the way for those who believe China could still move towards democracy, as Eastern Europe did after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.
We have a modernization theory that with the economic situation improving, and you are going to have more urbanization, more educated young people, and contact with the international society increasing, and that would lead invariably to pluralization and demand for democracy.
Some have given up on such predictions, but China may just be on a huge detour that dates back to just before 2012, when Xi Jinping and other hardline party members who experienced the Cultural Revolution began to reassert control in China. That ended a period of relative opening up with a new extremism that has soured U.S.-China relations.
They brought the result of their political socialization during that traumatic period of time to Chinese politics. But this generation is passing away. So sooner or later, China will move back, shift back to the original tendency, namely economic development and bringing about more pluralization. We just have to be patiently wait for that to happen.
Demands for democracy in China have been harshly suppressed, most prominently in the 1989 Tiananmen protests, later in the Hong Kong uprisings, and most recently in the 2022 COVID lockdown-inspired protests with blank paper, representing what cannot be said. Even if cracks in the facade like these periodically reappear, China under Xi has pushed in the opposite direction towards totalitarianism. Taiwan and democracy enjoyed more sympathy in China earlier in the 2000s.
But not today's China. So today's China, we do the survey, and I think we are not surprised. The majority of Chinese people is to follow Beijing's position. And they think that way from their heart. Nobody forced them to do that way. So in terms of political support or the ideology in China, it's not the way that higher educated people or young people are more liberal. It's on the opposite side.
His survey research shows only some people over 50, those who remember Tiananmen and the Cultural Revolution, may be sympathetic to democracy or to Taiwan.
Today's younger generation, they believe in the party-state propaganda. They really believe so. They thought the democracy of the Western society actually are chaotic. And the Western society got very bad human rights record. And Taiwan's democracy is chaotic, is a joke. That's what Beijing government taught its people. And so they don't really value election democracy,
Then again, the specter of democracy so rattles Xi's Communist Party that it recently began touting the outright fiction that China is already a democracy. This reflects fears that democracy brings chaos and the demise of one-party rule, as happened in the Soviet Union. While popular support for democracy could change if Chinese society came under pressure, hopes for a shift that might ease tensions with Taiwan seem distant.
You don't see a way of sitting down and talking and finding a solution which both sides could accept under the current circumstances.
I understand your question, but no. When Taiwan and China, Beijing and Taipei sit together on the table, it means Taiwan accepts the one China principle, which is Taiwan is one part of PRC. Well, both sides agree Taiwan is one part of China, but for Beijing, that China is PRC, and for Kuomintang or even for DPP, that part is ROC. ROC is not part of PRC. Even there was a time PRC is part of ROC. Okay, so I don't think there is a formula accepted by both sides. So maybe the current status quo tense situation is the best because it's better than any military invasion, than any military conflict.
台湾人民和朝野政党的最大的共识，就是捍卫主权，以及我们民主自由的生活方式。这一点，我们没有妥协的空间。
In other words, this dispute has no likely resolution, short of putting off an uncertain outcome. But the standoff could endure for years. The best hope for peace is through talks, cool heads, and making the cost of harassment or invasion by China ever higher. That is the counterpart to Taiwan Foreign Minister Joseph Wu's dictum. Xi Jinping must wake up every morning and think that today is not the day to attack Taiwan. I came to Taiwan in the 1970s, a clueless youth straight out of college, finding a frontierland full of anti-communist rage. I came back in the 1990s with a journalist's eye. Taiwan served up unbounded energy and rapid growth laced with undertows of the recent past. I returned 30 years later, after years as a foreign correspondent in Asia and Europe. I found a place that had come into its own, where democracy was in full flower, and people trusted one another and defended their freedoms. At first it was hard to believe, but sometimes and some places do allow people to be all they can be. And Taiwan today is the closest I have seen anywhere giving that to its citizens. It does what nations are supposed to do. Why is Taiwan undaunted? I saw people taking the future in their own hands, acting with tolerance to others, and living life to the fullest, despite everything.